Two KC-135s. One goes down in western Iraq. The other makes it back and lands. And almost immediately, the story splits in two. One side says this was an accident. The other says no, this was a shootdown. And if that second version is true, then this is not just the loss of an aircraft. This is a major U.S. strategic asset getting hit in the middle of an active war zone. First, we need to be clear about what a KC-135 actually is. This is not the glamorous part of airpower. It is not a stealth jet. It is not the flashy fighter everyone recognizes. But in modern warfare, the KC-135 is one of the aircraft that keeps the entire air campaign alive. It has been one of America's primary aerial refueling aircraft for decades. It is huge. More than 136 feet long, with a wingspan of nearly 131 feet, and standing over 41 feet tall. It carries an enormous amount of fuel and gives fighters, bombers, surveillance aircraft, and allied jets the range and endurance they need to stay in the fight. Put simply, fighters may be the fist, but the tanker is the lung. Without tankers, range shrinks. Time on station drops, and the entire rhythm of air operations starts to fall apart. That is why this incident got attention so fast. Then, CENTCOM released its first statement. According to the U.S. military, the incident happened in friendly airspace. 2 aircraft were involved. One crashed in western Iraq, the other landed safely. And most importantly, they said this was not caused by hostile fire, and not caused by friendly fire. Then came the human cost. At first, CENTCOM confirmed that 4 of the 6 crew members had been killed while recovery operations were still ongoing. Not long after that, they confirmed the worst-case outcome. All 6 crew members were dead. At that point, this should have become a tragic story about a catastrophic military aviation loss. But it did not, because almost at the same time, the Islamic Resistance in Iraq issued a statement claiming responsibility. They said they had shot down the KC-135 in defense of Iraqi sovereignty and Iraqi airspace. And from there, the whole story breaks into 3 main possibilities. The first is Iran. At a glance, that theory sounds believable. The KC-135 is a large aircraft. A very large one. This is not a stealth platform. If you only look at it in simple terms, systems like the S-300 or Bavar 373 absolutely sound capable of threatening a target that big. But that is not really the key question. The real question is not whether Iran could theoretically shoot down a KC-135. The real question is whether a KC-135 would realistically be operating in a place where Iran had the conditions to do it. And that is where the Iran theory starts to lose strength. A tanker, like the KC-135, is a strategic asset. You do not casually push it into the edge of an enemy air defense envelope, unless you absolutely have to. These aircraft usually work in safer airspace, over friendly territory, or at least well outside the most dangerous zone. So if the crash location is roughly where the U.S. says it was, in western Iraq, and then the idea of Iran directly scoring this kill with traditional long-range air defense starts to sound much less convincing. So yes, Iran has the technical ability to threaten a large aircraft. But whether Iran was in the right position to actually do that in this case is a very different question. And if you follow normal tanker operating logic, that answer leans toward no. Then comes the second possibility. And this one is much harder to dismiss: Iraq. More specifically, Iran-backed armed groups operating inside Iraqi territory. Unlike the theory of Iran shooting from afar, these groups would be much closer to the area where the incident happened. If anyone had the positional advantage to take a shot, it would be them. That is where the P-358 enters the discussion. This is not a clean, textbook surface-to-air missile. It is a very unusual design. It launches with a solid fuel booster, then transitions to a small turbojet engine and keeps flying. It is slower than a jet aircraft, but it can loiter and hunt air targets in a way that looks very different from a traditional SAM. And that matters, because this system is generally not optimized for chasing down fast jet aircraft in a classic head-on air defense scenario. It is more dangerous against drones, helicopters, and slower air targets. Some open-source reporting describes it as reaching roughly 28,000 feet, with a range of around 100 kilometers. If that is accurate, then on paper, it can reach the general altitude band where a KC-135 might operate during aerial refueling. That is exactly why this theory cannot be dismissed too quickly. Because if the tanker was at the right altitude, in the right corridor, at the right moment, then yes, a theoretical engagement window does exist. But the key word there is theoretical. To hit a KC-135, you do not just need a missile that can fly high enough. You need to know where the aircraft is. You need tracking data. You need a radar picture, a sensor chain, or some kind of targeting support strong enough to turn a distant aircraft into a real kill opportunity. Without that, you are just launching into a huge sky and hoping for a miracle. And that is the problem. The idea that an Iraqi armed group may have tried to engage the aircraft is absolutely believable. The idea that they may be claiming credit for propaganda value is also believable. But to prove they actually brought down this KC-135, they would need much more than a statement. They would need evidence, wreckage details, tracking data, a convincing chain of events. Until that exists, their claim remains a claim. Then we get to the third possibility. And honestly, this may be the least dramatic explanation, but also the most believable one. The two KC-135s may have collided in mid-air. That sounds brutal. But it is not far-fetched. A tanker supporting a long mission can support another tanker. That is not unusual in military aviation. Same fuel, same role, same need to keep the mission alive longer. The problem is that aerial refueling is one of the most precision-heavy things you can do in the sky. Everything has to line up. Altitude, closure rate, spacing, position, crew coordination, situational awareness. And when the aircraft involved are both massive, even a small error can become catastrophic. It does not take a Hollywood-level mistake, just a slight drift, a small misread, a bad moment during a long, demanding mission. That is enough to turn a routine operation into a disaster. That is why the collision theory feels so credible, because it does not require a long chain of assumptions. It just requires a stressful mission, a difficult operating environment, and one small error at altitude. And if one aircraft fell while the other managed to drag itself back down to the ground, that picture fits a collision scenario a lot better than it fits a clean shootdown that the U.S. immediately denied was hostile fire. So where does that leave us? First, CENTCOM is still holding a very clear position. They say this was not hostile fire and not friendly fire. Second, the Islamic Resistance in Iraq has publicly claimed responsibility. But a public claim is not the same thing as proof. Third, if you are asking which explanation feels the most realistic right now, the answer may be the ugliest one. Two tankers, one long mission, one small mistake, and one disaster. And that may be the coldest part of this whole story. Because in modern war, the thing that kills is not always the enemy missile. Sometimes it is the pace of operations. Sometimes it is fatigue. Sometimes it is what happens when giant machines and highly trained crews are forced to operate in an environment where the margin for error is almost zero. Losing a KC-135 is already a major event. But what makes this story even bigger is what happened immediately after. Every side tried to pull the loss into the version of reality it wanted to tell. The U.S. says it was not hostile fire. The Iraqi resistance says it was their strike. And the truth may still be sitting somewhere inside flight data, wreckage analysis, technical reporting, and an investigation the public has not fully seen yet. If you had to sum it up in one line, it would be this: Iran directly shooting down the tanker looks unconvincing. Iraq says it did it, but has not shown enough to lock that story in. And a collision between two KC-135s in the middle of a high-pressure mission still looks like the ugliest, most painful, and most realistic explanation of all.